And welcome everybody, even those people who are viewing the board meeting today. Welcome as well.
Put his mic.
Get on with it. I need a motion and a second to accept the agenda as presented or modified.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Public forum, we'll open, at this time, we'll open the public forum. If anyone chooses to speak. Seeing none, we will close the public forum. Motion and second, I need a motion and a second to approve the Waverly Utilities July 10, 2018 regular meeting minutes.
So moved.
Second.
Any further discussion, questions? All those in favor of accepting the minutes from July 10, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Internal control, Casey.
This month, we chose to review the internal controls surrounding petty cash. The testing template and results are attached for your review. The only thing that I changed from last year was I did update for the petty cash that the customer service department has up front. We did find no deficiencies during our testing.
Okay, I'll need a motion and a second to approve internal control petty cash.
So moved. Second.
Any further questions, Casey? Discussion?
Just one question. Are you doing anything to limit the amount of petty cash? I know, like, our company, we try to limit cash and get everything, via check or et cetera. Are we doing anything to limit?
We haven't yet. I mean, with it just starting in July 1st, we're still kind of monitoring levels. We're taking daily deposits to the bank. Until we get a feel for, everybody getting set up on auto pay. July was a big month where everybody had to make payments. So, we had to have cash there because the volume of cash is quite significant. So down the road, yeah, I think, with Jen's letter that she sent out this week, here are your payment options, encouraging people to use auto pay, that I would hope that would mean that the cash would decrease. However, you're still going to have, we get people, college kids who bring in 3 different sets of cash, well, this is my third or this is my fifth, portion, so. But we will watch that.
Thank you.
Any further questions? All in favor of accepting internal control petty cash, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Resolution 50-18, fall protection equipment. Kurt?
Yes, this policy is an operation policy for the staff that work in the field. It's guidance that we've followed for a number of years. It was a thing that the safety committee had put together that they felt was important enough to have some guidance around for staff to reference in their day-to-day operations. So it just becomes part of our operation policies that the board has adopted in the past.
Any further questions? Motion, I need a motion and a second to approve.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, questions?
Kurt, what's any differences from previous years that you want to highlight?
This is a new policy. It was just guidance that we had internal conversations before. This is a written policy for staff to follow.
Okay. But from written policy, previous years, any real major changes?
Not major. We follow OSHA guidelines, and then also we ran it past through ESCI, who's our safety consultant as well. But nothing too major. Probably in the last couple of years, was fall arrestor protection on anything when you're working on distances higher than 4 feet probably came more into play.
Great, thank you.
Any further? Secretary, please call the roll.
Buckingham,
Aye.
Neuendorf,
Yes.
Runkhorst,
Aye.
Sakerman.
Yes.
Weiberberg.
Yes. Information items, I have nothing. Does anybody have anything they'd like? Okay. Other business? Anybody have anything they'd like to bring up?
I have a question for Daryl. Daryl, I know some people have made comments about dropping off bills. I'm not sure, our payments, you want to talk about anything there, or?
You talking about the potential Dropbox?
Yeah.
Yeah, we looked at some potential sites. We need to move the post office box to accommodate a payment drop box, and we're looking into that, and I think we'll probably have that completed shortly.
Within, you think, next 30 days, or? If
Yeah, I
you get
think
approval.
probably before the snow falls.
Cool.
I hope that's longer than 30 days.
Give me a little extra time there.
Okay.
Thanks, Darrell. It's a nice thing.
Anything else? All right, board calendar. Any comments on that? Any changes? Anybody see any problems with the dates?
I will be out of town on that date in September, and I won't be at a place where I can call either, so.
It's good to be able not to be reached.
Yeah. Middle of Great Glacier National Park or somewhere right there.
Nice, very good. So, September 11th, no problems for anyone. October 9th, no problems for anyone. November 13th, and December 11th. Then that'll get us to January to present the 2019 budgets. Any other comments on any dates, Darrell? Okay. Thank you. Waverly Municipal Electric Utility, ratify the WMEU trade accounts. Casey?
So you should have attached the trade accounts for July, and the only big thing that stuck out is we did pay for our new bucket truck, number 109, to Alltech for $237,000. That was included in our bond from 2016.
Okay. I need a motion and a second to accept the financials or trade accounts as presented.
So moved.
Second?
Any further question, discussions? All those in favor of accepting, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Financials, Casey.
For June month end, total revenues year-to-date are $950,000 higher than the 2018 budget. $742,000 of that is related to the mean refund from last year. Kilowatt hour sales year-to-date are 3.3 million higher than the June 2017 year-to-date. Operating expenses are $132,000 lower than the year-to-date budget. Major drivers in this is a decrease in lower Louisa and WS4 costs, as well as diesel generation expenses. Net income is 1.1 million higher than the 2018 year-to-date budget, and we feel we are on track.
Very good, excellent. I'll need a motion and a second to accept financials as presented.
Move approval.
Second.
Any further questions, discussions? Any comments on that, Darrell?
Very positive.
Good news. Yep, very good. All those in favor of accepting the financials, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Resolution 5118, reimbursement resolution. Casey?
So we do this every month to look back for the 18 months, should we decide to bond, which I think we're looking at bonding this fall. This month, we purchased some meters, the Louisa and WS4 generation. We did have to put a Southgate controller at the distribution plant, and then another bill for the Cogsdale implementation.
Okay. Any further questions, discussions? Need a motion and I need a motion and a second to approve the resolution 5118.
So moved. Second.
Any further questions, discussion? Secretary, please call the roll.
Neuendorf,
Yes.
Sagerman,
Yes.
Buckingham.
Yes.
Weiberberg,
Yes.
Runcorst.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries. Information items, cost of service study. Mr. Berg, welcome. If you could say a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from, what's your favorite color? No.
Sure. I'm Dave Berg. I am a mostly cost of service and rate design consultant. I live in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. I'm actually a sole proprietor consultant. I've got about 32 years of experience in the industry and was hired to take a look at the electric rates for Waverly. And what I'd like to do today is, you should all have hopefully a copy of the report. And what I'd like to do is basically take you through a few of the important tables which kind of summarize the information that I utilize to develop the recommendations that I've got relative to rates. Now, when we're looking at rates for a utility, there's really sort of two things that are important. One, obviously, is that rates are the price tag that is put on the product, in this case, electricity, that the utility is selling. So obviously, they generate the monies that are needed for the utility to maintain a positive and strong fiscal bottom line. So oftentimes, if rate increases are needed, it's simply because more money is needed to keep the utility financially afloat. The second piece is what we call cost of service analysis. And this really goes to probably the fairness issue relative to rates, as far as different groups of customers, such as residential, commercial, and industrial customers. How does the cost to serve these groups of customers compare to the revenues that you're receiving from them? It also goes to, within rates themselves, looking at the relative level of rates, for instance, in residential rates, how much is in the customer charge versus how much is in the consumption or the energy charge, those types of things. So those are really the two pieces that I'm going to summarize the results of, and then indicate how those have worked themselves into the recommendations that I'm going to be making relative to rates. So the first thing we're going to talk about is sort of financial status. And if you go in section 2 of the report on page 5,
One over there, we don't have anything over here. Is that good enough?
sure.
Okay. And you should have it on your screens now?
Yep.
We just have to switch here.
So
Thanks, Tab.
Yes.
He's scrolling.
What's wrong with my mouse?
You got it? Okay. I fixed it. Good, thank you.
all right, are we all set? Okay, so table 2-3 within the report. What this table is a representation of, it is a projection of the operating results for the electric utility under the assumption that no change in any of the existing rates is made going forward. And so we've got a projection of sales, which quite frankly, we've included no growth in sales going forward, which is really not actually all that unusual in our industry right now, because essentially what we're seeing on an industry-wide basis is that any sort of natural growth that we've got relative to new housing and those types of things is actually being countered by energy efficiency measures. And so, you know, really having no projections of growth is not unusual, and the vast majority of utilities that I've been working with lately, that's kind of our overriding assumption. And actually, when you look on the country as a whole, we're actually not really seeing any growth in overall electric consumption.
And Darrell, wouldn't that be fair to say that's true of us? I mean, we looked at our own consumption over the last 10 years, and it's very flat.
Yeah, and I think I pointed out, 10 years ago, we sold 148 million kilowatt hours, and last year we sold 148 million kilowatt hours, so it's very true.
So when we look at the results in table 2-3, and you basically look down at that change in net position number, you'll see that for all intents and purposes, really the first 3 years, 2018 through 2020, the bottom line is, for all intents and purposes, basically zero. You know, it's a little bit negative this year, it's a little bit positive, 2019 is a projection, and then very, very close, essentially to zero in 2020. Now you'll notice that it kind of takes a drop in 2021 and 2022, where it drops down to a more significant $600,000 or $700,000 in the red. The primary reason for that drop is that the utility is utilizing available rate stabilization fund dollars, which is essentially money that from previous years that had been set aside. That money is being used in these 3 years. But then what's happening is that those dollars have been exhausted at that point. So they're not available to sort of shore up operating results. So that's why you see that change in 2021 and 2022 relative to the bottom line. It's not that there's some big expense that changed or something else that's going on. It's essentially that the utility is planning to utilize these rate stabilizations funds, which is sort of a short-term savings account, if you will, that was established, and those funds then will no longer be available at that point. Now, while seeing negative operating results is obviously something that is concerning, what's really important, quite frankly, when you are a municipally owned utility is what's happening to your cash balances relative to kind of looking at what's going on with kind of dollars in the bank. And so if we go to the next page, the first thing we're looking at is total cash reserves. So we start off with, and the reason that I say total cash reserves is that there are both what are called restricted and unrestricted cash reserves, as well as some designated cash reserves. So some of these are basically reserves that are needed based on either rules that the utility has set themselves or some rules that have been established for you from the financial community. Whereas unrestricted cash, which we'll get to in a moment, is the kind of cash that's just sort of available for whatever it might be needed for going forward. So we can see that you start off with about $8.9 million at the beginning of this year in the total cash balance. We then add or subtract the bottom line, which was in that previous table, that change in net position. We then add in depreciation, because depreciation is an operating expense. So when we were looking at the expenses in the previous table, the depreciation expense is in there. However, it's a non-cash expense. The utility doesn't have to write a check to anybody to pay for depreciation. So we can actually add that back into our analysis of what's going on with the cash balances. We then also, Casey mentioned a few minutes ago about the assumption that there might possibly be a bond issue this year. And in this analysis, we have assumed that the utility will be issuing bonds this year with a net proceeds of bonds that's available to help pay for particularly capital items of just over $2.9 million. So those available dollars are added into this analysis. We then have to subtract out the principal payments that are being made on debt. Within the operating results, the previous table that we looked at, only the interest expense actually shows up in the accounting in operating results, whereas the principal payments need to come out of the cash as shown here. There's also then a new principal payment that's associated with that bond issue that we've assumed. We also have Waverly buys its wholesale power from an organization whose acronym is called MEAN. And depending upon their bottom line each year, they make refunds, if available, to their customers, their members. And so we've got an anticipated refund this year from MEAN. And then we also then have to subtract off capital improvements, because those aren't actually an operating expense in the previous table. So when you go through all of this going forward, we show total cash going from about $8.9 million at the beginning of our study period to about $7.3 million by the end of 2022. It actually stays about level through about 2021. In fact, it builds up a bit and then starts to come back down a bit. So when you look at total cash, looking at the 5-year study period, it goes down slightly, and most of that downward turn is in the last year. So when you look at that, that doesn't look too bad. Now, as I also mentioned, this is unrestricted cash, restricted cash, and designated funds are all three in there. So we've gone one step further to look at the unrestricted cash, because these are the dollars that are available to the utility to cover things that might come up.
Dave?
Yes.
Before we go there, just back on the unrestricted.
Sure.
I mean, you just mentioned that it's, it's not too concerning that we go from 8.9 to 7.2, although it still seems like, you don't want to be going down necessarily. And during that time, I mean, we did borrow 3 million to help kind of prop up the, cash position, so.
Sure.
I mean, is that something that we shouldn't be then concerned about, or?
Let me take one aspect of that question first, and that's relative to the borrowing. Now, electric utilities are very capital-intensive businesses. And even though you're buying your power from somebody else, which means you don't have to own the power plants and so on, but when you take a look at the system and you look at substations and the distribution lines and the service to customers and all of the equipment that's needed, I think recently, just earlier, Casey mentioned, a truck that was 200 and some $1,000. Very, very, sort of expensive and capital intensive. So borrowing to pay for those things is sort of standard operating procedure at most utilities. And in fact, to a certain extent, there's a cost of service basis for doing that, because part of the theory is that when you borrow to pay for large capital items, as you stretch that debt service over a period of time, then actually the people who are utilizing that equipment, those whatever infrastructure you put in place, are then also paying for it. There's a cost of service issue if you save up dollars to always pay cash for everything. Part of the issue with that from a cost basis is that, to a certain extent, yesterday's customers are paying extra so that you can save up dollars to pay cash for things, which then benefit tomorrow's customers. Now, of course, many times those are the same people, but things do change and businesses change and homeowners change. So, having a certain amount of debt is not particularly unusual. So to a certain extent, I wouldn't worry too much about that. The other thing relative to the overall level, I think we're going to see in the next table maybe a little bit more to the answer there. Because relative to what's in the designated and restricted funds, those dollars, you're meeting whatever requirements each of those funds have. And so that is still within the analysis. So the real issue has to where are you at on the unrestricted, which is what the next table that we'll look at, so we can address that. So now we're at table 2-5 on page 7 of this section. This looks at just the unrestricted cash reserve. So what we're doing here is we start off with the total cash reserve end of year, which comes from the previous table. We're then subtracting off the designated funds and the restricted funds. And if you want more detail on what is in those funds, I'm sure Casey would love to chat with you about that. That then leaves us with the unrestricted cash. Now, unrestricted cash is important because that's the dollars that are available for emergencies, for unexpected capital items, for anything that might come up on a short-term basis where you might need dollars. So now when we look at the unrestricted cash, you can see that we're staying $4 to $5 million as we look at the end of year. So it's more or less flat. Now, you actually have a policy relative to the amount of dollars that you want the utility to have in unrestricted cash. And it's basically 15% of the annual cash requirements for the utility, which is essentially operating expenses, not including depreciation, because as I previously mentioned, that's a non-cash item, plus transfers to the city, plus principal payments on debt, plus capital improvements. So you'll notice here I have a line which is in the $22 million range of the utility cash requirements based on your formula each year. And then when we look at how much unrestricted cash we have, we compare that to the 15% requirement. And you can see that we're starting off about 1.2 million over that requirement, and it ends up at about 700,000 over that requirement. So that all still looks really good. However, an important caveat is that buried within the restricted and designated funds is that rate stabilization fund that I mentioned earlier. That actually within the analysis is ending up at negative $2.7 million. So while all of these tables look like you're sort of meeting all of your requirements, there is actually buried in that one fund about a $2.7 million deficit. Now, if you wanted to actually cover that, that would take about a 4.5% increase starting in 2019 for the 4 years in order to bring that up to zero. Now, especially for those who are listening, that's not what we're recommending. Because there's sort of a caveat here. The first 3 years, everything stays pretty good under the assumptions that we have in the study. Now, there are several things in projections, particularly the further out we go, that get to be a little more iffy the further you go. Some of the things that are important is, how much debt might you actually take on? Because we've got this about $3 million debt assumption in this. If you borrow more money, it actually makes the short-term results look better because obviously you push those dollars into later years. I also showed in the cash balances that $742,000 refund coming from your wholesale provider. We haven't included any of those beyond this year, but in fact, you could get more of those. You can't count on them, but they have been coming in fairly regularly, so there could be additional refunds there. The capital improvements number, the number that's in here, I know that the staff in particular really went sort of as lean as they could on their capital improvement budget for the next 5 years. But where that ultimately ends up can have a fairly significant impact. And the other thing that can have a big impact is sales. Now, I mentioned that we have no projected growth in sales, but one of the big things that really kind of varies is weather. For instance, this summer has been fairly warm. And so when it's a warm summer, people are utilizing their air conditioner more, sales go up, which actually improves the bottom line of the utility. However, if you end up with a cool summer, sales can go lower. And then what happens is that actually has a detrimental effect on the bottom line. So within the recommendation that we've got relative to the rates is that we're not recommending a rate increase at this time. And based on the projections for 2 or 3 years, that should probably be no problem financially. However, what's important is that the utility, and specifically staff and the board, kind of need to keep their eye on the ball. Because in particular, once the availability of the rate stabilization funds, which have been saved from previous years, sort of goes away, you've lost a bit of that cushion that you've been relying on. And so there may be a need in year 3, 4, or 5 for a rate increase. And of course, that's why you've got the budget coming up and you're always looking at these things. And I'm not going to even begin to imply that you're not keeping an eye on the bottom line. But we have no recommendation for a rate increase at this time relative to the operating results, just with the caveat of you got to make sure to keep an eye on that. Another big thing is what's happening with the market prices for wholesale power, which have been relatively low, which is favorable when you're a buyer. And if those move up for whatever reason, that also can have an impact on your bottom line. So maybe before we move into the next phase of the report, which is the cost of service, are there any other questions or comments relative to what I've talked about so far?
Well, just one other thing on your projection. You said sales flat. What about expenses? Did you have an inflation, or what did you do there?
Yes, and we do have an inflationary number within expenses because the number of people you have may not change, but the cost of labor, the cost of benefits, those things all go up. So yes, we have increases in operating expenses. But we don't have increases in total kilowatt hours and basically, products sold.
Oh, just what was that inflation? Did you have
We had 3%.
Okay.
So that's in like table 2, 3, less operating expenses, you just see it going up.
Well, and you can't apply it just to that line item because there's a whole bunch of different things in that line item. And so particularly wholesale power, which is a big part of your operating expenses, that sort of has its own projections, some of which we've utilized information that you've gotten from your wholesale supplier. So if you were to put a calculator to it, it probably wouldn't come out where I'm at, because there's different line items and different assumptions within individual line items on some of those things.
Dave, did we leave wholesale flat over this period, or was there an escalator in there?
I'd have to go back and look in that. There's an escalator because, yeah, there is an escalator in there because the adjustment goes up.
One other on the, on the other side, it looked like our cash position was kind of going down a little bit, as you described, and so on. But, I didn't see where debt specifically was kind of pointed out in here. But I assume that's sort of going down as well, because we borrowed in 2018, but in all those future years, we didn't, and yet we were paying off debt, so.
Well, and there isn't any big one that drops off in the period. If you look back in table 2-4, you can see the principal payments.
Right, that's what I was
And,
looking at.
As is normally the case when you're, just like with your mortgage, what you're seeing is the principal payments on existing debt are going up. That's because the interest payments are going down and the total debt payment is basically level. And so there's no significant existing debt that drops off within this period, because then you would see that principal payment line item go down. But then you also see then we've got the new principal payment added here under the assumption of the new debt as well.
And Bob, I believe the CREB bonds fall off in 2023?
That sounds about right. I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, so that'd be just right after this period, so CREB bonds were for the wind generators.
And that would change the projection beyond 2022 that we have here. Dave, could you talk a little bit more about the amount over the 15% requirement? Is that comfortable enough? Again, it's a gamble. I mean, it depends on what catastrophic thing will happen, but.
Well, and it's interesting because a question I get a lot is what is sort of the right amount of cash reserves? And so kind of every utility has to sort of figure that out for themselves. And, I would say that your 15% of the cash requirements is a very reasonable. I would never argue that it's too much. One of the interesting things that you find is that the smaller the utility, the higher cash reserves they need as compared to operating expenses. Because any one incident, such as loss of a significant piece of equipment, for them can be a much bigger deal than it is for larger utilities. So you're sort of a medium-sized municipal utility. And so I would say, based on my experience and my judgment, that the amount of cash, unrestricted cash reserves that you have is a very reasonable number. I certainly would never say that it should be any lower than what you've got. The other thing is you've got a fair number of kind of other reserve funds that a number of utilities don't have. And so that sort of bolsters your overall cash position as well.
Okay.
So you mean like the designated fund and restricted funds that we have?
Well, I think in particular the designated, usually restricted funds are things like debt service reserve funds that you simply have to have, you have to agree to that. That's a legal requirement placed on you by the issuers of the bonds. But some of your designated funds are the ones that are more unique to your particular situation and this utility.
Darryl, what are some of those? Do you-
Your vehicle fund, I believe the green reserve fund, rate stabilization fund, and I think in your monthly board packet, it lists out all of those funds that are in there.
The Insurance Recovery Fund is one of the biggest funds, and that's over $1 million, so we do have that one. Something tragic.
And that's not in this 15%? Okay.
Right. Because the unrestricted cash I mean, the name in and of itself is, this is cash that's just sort of available. And every utility needs them. I mean, it absolutely does. You think in terms of something as simple as like an ice storm. Okay, well, you've got the damage associated with an ice storm, but the other thing that you can have is a a period of loss of revenue as well. In that, if people aren't able to, buy it, if their power is out for an extended period of time because of an event like that, they're not buying and paying for electricity. However, the vast majority of your expenses, which are fixed, don't go away because of that. Plus, you have the additional short-term cash need relative to responding to an event like that. Okay, the next item is cost of service, which is section 3. And I'm just going to go ahead and take you to page 6, table 3-3. So what we do in a cost of service study is we look at the total expenses, or a term we use is called revenue requirements of the utility. And through an analysis of allocation, we determine the allocated cost to serve different kinds of customers. Because quite frankly, serving a residential customer is different than serving a commercial customer, is different than serving an industrial customer. And so the cost basis that we look at is different for all of those customers. So what we've done in table 3-3, looking at the expenses of the utility in 2017 as allocated to each of these groups of customers, and comparing that to the amount of revenue as a percentage of the total that you're getting from those groups of customers. So we've got the residential group, the commercial group, the industrial group, and then the municipal group, which is essentially sales to the city. And so when you look at the first column, the allocated cost to serve, you can see that we've estimated that 34.1% of the cost of the utility is basically due to service to residential customers. And then 11.2 for commercial, and so on. And we compare that then to the revenues. So we're showing about 36.4% of the revenue coming from residential, and then the others as we go down. So that column on the far right called increase, decrease. Again, this does not represent a recommendation. This is just a way of comparing the allocated cost to serve to the revenues that are received from those groups. So this would indicate that residential is about 6% higher revenue than it should be, whereas commercial is about 5% lower than it should be. Now, one of the important things to understand about cost of service is that it is not an exact science. There are a fair number of assumptions that go into the analysis. My rule of thumb is that anything within about 5% is essentially cost-based. And so when we look at that far right column, you're actually in pretty good shape on a cost of service basis, in that the allocated cost to serve each of these major groups of customers, when compared to the revenues received from them, in general, is in pretty good shape. So again, without the overall increase in revenues, we're not addressing any sort of disparities between classes here in any significant way in the recommendation that I've got. I do have some rate recommendations, which we'll talk about in a moment, where there are some changes, and certain customers will see slight increases or slight decreases. But overall, we're not looking at a significant change in total revenues, nor in total revenues for the class. There's actually a very slight increase in the commercial class based on the recommendation. It's less than 0.2%. And the others are basically sort of revenue neutral. But within the cost of service analysis, looking at different rate components, that hasn't had an impact on the recommendations that I'm giving, which I will address when I discuss those. So, and I also had, appeared at one of your meetings earlier this summer, and we talked a little bit more at length about the cost of service analysis. So relative to my recommendations with regard to the rates, if you go to the very end of the report, there's Exhibit 4-A. It's the last 2 pages of the report. And what I'm going to do is just walk you through each of the classes in order to describe what I have recommended relative to rates and give you the background around why I've made the recommendation that I've had. Now, with some of these, you'll notice across the top that it shows 2019 rate, 2020 rate, 2021, 2022. With some of those, they don't actually change after the first year. That the same rate sort of holds going all the way through. And this goes back to the discussion earlier in that while I'm showing rates all the way through 2022, none of the rates here result in any kind of appreciable change in total revenue. So that if by 2021 there's a need for additional revenue, you would have to have rates that would be higher than what I'm showing in these tables. So the first one is the residential service called ER01. Obviously, this is kind of your big residential class. So, a good portion of your residential sales are within this class. And what you've got in this class is you have got a customer charge that every customer pays every month. And then you have seasonal rates. You have a different rate in the summer, which is a 4-month period of June through September, and then a winter or non-summer rate, which is the other 8 months. And if you look at, there's that customer charge, the current is $18 per month. And then you'll notice there are 3 lines for winter, but you'll notice that the rates are all the same, 11.32 cents per kilowatt hour. So you actually just have a single consumption rate in the winter. That no matter how much energy a residential customer uses in the wintertime, it's always at the same 11.32 cent rate. So I have no change in that winter rate. You'll notice that those stay the same all the way across. If you go back, and I'm going to come back to the customer charge in just a second. Now in the summer, you have a different kind of rate in the summer, and it's called an inclining block rate. And the reason it's called an inclining block rate is that there are 3 different consumption levels. And as a customer moves up through consumption, the rate actually increases or inclines upward. So you'll notice that for the first 600 kilowatt hours, it's 11.36 cents. Now, just to give you an idea, the summer average consumption for residential customers is about 750 kilowatt hours. So you can see that the vast majority of consumption for an average customer is actually at that cheapest summer rate of 11.36 cents. Then for the next 500, so taking us from 600 to 1100 kilowatt hours, that rate jumps by a couple of cents to 13.59 cents. And then if you're over 1100 kilowatt hours, it jumps all the way up to 18.65 cents. Now, that 18.65 is actually 64% higher than the 11 cent rate. So it's a pretty significant jump into what we call that last block. Now, when those rates were first instituted, we had very high market prices, particularly in the summertime when demand is very high. The market for electricity has changed dramatically, and actually market prices, even on hot days, are much, much lower than they used to be. Now that 18.65 cents is it's not really a cost-based rate, it's more of a policy decision relative to trying to encourage conservation. And it can be effective, and I think it has been effective. I'm actually though recommending that that last block come down, that given current circumstances in the industry, that it is actually a lot higher than it really should be, and that sort of the penalty on that usage is more significant than it should be. The other thing is, only about 3% of your annual sales to residential customers actually exists in that third tier block in the summertime. So there's actually not a lot of energy. There's a fair amount of conservation that's been going on across the industry. And I think it happens almost no matter what you're doing with rates because of what's happening with appliances and with lighting in particular, that a lot of the energy efficiency has been accomplished, and changing the rate won't impact that. So what I'm suggesting is that you still have a summer inclining block rate, but that really, really high third block actually be brought down to be the same as that second block. So it essentially have a 2-block rate then, where we go from basically the 11 cents up to the 13.5 cents, which is still almost a 20% increase in the rate as you get above, now as you get above the 600 kilowatt hours. And then to go back to the recommendation on the customer charge, essentially what I'm recommending is that the customer charge go up $1 per month. And in our industry in particular, where we've got a fair amount of volatility in our usages and where we have either flat or sometimes declining usages because of, in particular, energy efficiency and conservation, what we're seeing is that utilities need to focus somewhat more on some of the fixed, sort of non-consumption related portions of the rate. So I'm recommending that the customer charge for residential go from $18 to $19, which essentially means the vast majority of your customers will see a $1 per month increase in their bill. Because we have no change in the winter rates. We have no change in actually the first 600 kilowatt hours. I'm suggesting that that rate in the summertime go from 11.36 down to the 11.32 just to match the winter rate. And then, so as I mentioned, you know, very few of your sales are actually in that last highest block in the summertime. So some of those people will see a slight reduction in their bills. But for the most part, we're looking at about $1 per customer increase depending upon usages in the residential class. And actually, just sort of quickly, if the rural residential, where their rate actually mirrors the residential, except for they have their customer charge is already $1 higher, I've essentially had the same recommendation there, a $1 increase and the same recommended changes in their energy rates. And then you'll also see something very similar in the residential electric heat rate. The only difference there is that has got in the wintertime what's called a declining block rate. So that's that third group, and you'll notice that there it's only 5 cents a kilowatt hour in the wintertime as an incentive for utilizing electric heat in the wintertime where usages are lower than they are in the summer. And while that 5 cent rate is a little bit too attractive, and what I'm suggesting is that over the next 2 years, that rate be raised to 6 cents. So I'm going to pause to see if there's any questions about kind of these 3 big primary residential rate groups.
So remind me, you said in the summer, the vast majority of our residential customers fall in which tier?
Well, the average usage in the summer is 750 kilowatt hours. So that first block is 0 to 600. So for an average customer, 600 out of 750 is in that first block. Yes. You also have a couple of rates that actually prior to my being hired to conduct this study, that those rates are going to be discontinued. There's the efficiency rider rate and the electric heating rider rate. And basically, the efficiency folks are being moved into the regular ER01 rate, and the electric heating rider folks are being moved into the electric heat rate, and that's going to be happening in 2020. So I've made a recommendation, sort of keeping in line with the things that we've been doing with the other rates for what would happen in 19. But then after 19, those two rates will be discontinued and those people will be moved into those other rates. And I don't have any reason to recommend that change not be made. There's very few customers in either one of those rates, and they'd be better off just placed in the regular rate. So I stand by the utility's decision to have done that. So the next major group would be commercial, and especially your sort of regular commercial rate, which is the ECO2 rate. Now, what's interesting is, as we looked in the residential rates, you had what we called an inclining block rate, where the more you use, the more expensive it gets. In the commercial, the regular commercial rate, it's actually the exact opposite. And it's what we call a declining rate, where the more you use, then it gets cheaper. And what I'm suggesting here is that a declining block rate really isn't appropriate either. While that inclining rate, and I had no problem with the structure, but that the incline was a little too steep in the residential. However, this declining block rate in the commercial class, I'm recommending that we start moving towards bringing up the second block, both in winter and summer. So you'll notice that right now, there's a $36.40 customer charge. Then in the winter, the first 2,000 kilowatt hours is 10.3 cents, and then it goes down to 9.17 cents above the 2,000. Now, your average commercial customer is about 2,200 kilowatt hours. So really, it's right there at about that 2,000 break, where then anybody who's kind of above average starts to buy more and more energy at the cheaper rate. So what's happening in this class is that smaller commercial customers, small stores, small restaurants, who actually, honestly, a lot of times don't use energy much different than a house might, they're paying a lot more because they have this $36 customer charge that they are spreading over very few kilowatt hours, and they're paying the higher energy rate. So what I'm suggesting is that over time, we move up in both winter and summer, and I basically have it going up a little bit each year going forward. At the same time, I'm bringing down the customer charge by about 50 cents per month going forward. So essentially what will happen is some of the smaller customers, those who use 2,000 kilowatt hours or less, will see a slight decrease in their bills. And then some of the larger customers who are using quite a bit more than 2,000 will see a slight increase in their bills. But there really isn't a good rationale for this declining block rate in the commercial class. And really, my recommendation is that ultimately we're moving sort of gradually over time where you would just have a single energy rate. Now, it might be seasonal, and I have no problem with seasonal rates, but that there would just be a single consumption rate for commercial class.
So, I mean, that sort of begs the question, why not? I mean, this is over a 4-year period. Why not get rid of all the differential sometime during that period, just for simplicity?
Well, and what I also was trying to do was basically keep revenues sort of steady. And oftentimes, if you can phase rate changes in over time, which I think you do have the capability to do that, a lot of times it's just easier to phase them in over time so that any individual customers who are seeing sort of change one way or the other don't see sort of a sudden change. I mean, you certainly could, and you would have this, this capability if you liked, to jump all the way to the last rate if you would like to do that. At the point that it comes time to make that recommendation, I've just, in my experience in doing this, that a lot of folks, when they can, they like to phase in rate changes rather than just, make the jump all at once if it's not necessary. Sometimes it's simply necessary. If you need a significant rate increase, you do, and you don't have the luxury of doing it over time.
No, I mean, I was just reacting to the changes seem so slight that, why bother with the difference after a few years? But
And again, if as a board that you make that decision, if you say, well, if we jump all the way to the 2022 rate, it's still not that much of a change, that wouldn't give me any heartburn.
But to understand your strategy, I mean, once again, you think commercial, you don't need to have you should not have a differential. But for residential, you should have a differential based on kilowatts.
Yes, and there's actually a reason that we do that.
Okay. And tell me that reason.
Sure. One of the reasons is within residential, we have a good sense for what's a lot of kilowatt hours residential. All right, we know that, an average customer is 700-ish. And you know that if you get to 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000 kilowatt hours, anything above 2,000 kilowatt hours is getting to be quite a bit of consumption within the residential class. And so we can put in these incentives of, you're kind of using more than your fair share, some people would say, and that try to get them to concentrate some on efficiency. Now, the challenge in the commercial class is that the commercial class isn't as homogeneous as the residential class. I mean, within the residential class, once you get to about 4,000 kilowatt hours, you probably only have a small handful of homeowners that are using more than that. So sort of the bandwidth of usage within the residential class is such that it's fairly easily in our industry to sort of make a judgment as to what's a lot. But in the commercial class, it's a much broader class. So let's just take an example of a small grocery store versus a medium grocery store. They're both doing kind of the same business, and maybe one is 3,000 square feet and one is 20,000 square feet. Well, the one that's 20,000 square feet is going to use a lot more energy, but you know what? They might be using less energy per square foot, per dollar of groceries sold. They might actually be doing a better job of utilizing energy than the small one, or they might not. But the thing is it's very difficult in the commercial class to make a judgment about what's a lot, because the customers aren't as homogeneous as homes are relative to thinking in terms of what may or may not constitute a lot of energy. The other thing is that overall this declining block structure of paying less if you're utilizing more is really kind of going away in our industry, and particularly within classes like this, the industry is moving to more of a sort of a flat rate, just a single rate, and definition of what that class looks like. But it's harder to make kind of a value judgment in the commercial class that is much easier to make in the residential class.
Thank you.
What's the history behind, I know it's been this declining rate for some time. What's the history behind, you weren't here, but nobody probably
I
in this
can
room
tell you
was.
from an industry perspective.
Yeah,
When I first got involved in the industry back in the 80s, for those old enough to remember, we had a bit of an energy crisis and a huge recession, late 70s, early 80s. And quite frankly, the bottom dropped out of our economy. Prior to that, our economy was going like crazy. And what was happening in our industry is we were building power plants because we were assuming we were going to have 7% growth forever. And we were building lots of big power plants. Big coal, big nuclear power plants were being built in the 70s, all under the assumption that this growth was going to just keep going and going and going. So lots of them were built. The other thing is it took years to build them. So you can't just all of a sudden one day say, oh, we don't need it, because it's 80% completed. And what happened in the 80s was, all of a sudden, we were awash in electric generating capacity. Our load had disappeared because the economy had tanked back when interest rates were 15%, when inflation was double digit. And so we had all of these power plants that had been built. So now the marginal cost of providing energy was very, very cheap. It was just the cost of coal or the cost of uranium to generate energy. So lots and lots and lots of utilities did declining block rates for the exact opposite reason of why we're doing inclining block rates today. It was to encourage customers to utilize energy. We wanted people to use energy for electric energy for everything. We wanted it to be more economical than natural gas for heating or than propane. We wanted businesses, we wanted industry, we wanted everybody because we had built all of these power plants that were sitting there not being utilized. So a lot of utilities, simply on inertia, that basic structure still exists, although a lot of them have eliminated over the last 10 years probably, but there's still plenty of utilities, and it's really sort of a legacy design that goes back to that time period. Let's see, let's go down as we work our way through the rates. General service demand, which is the ELGD rate. Now, what's different here is these customers are billed both based on their energy and the demand that they place on the system. So they have a two-part rate as compared to sort of regular residential and commercial, which only pay an energy rate. Now you'll notice that the energy rates are quite a bit less, like 6 cents or so compared to 10 to 11 cents. But that's because a portion of the revenue that you're getting from them is in the demand charge. Now, what we've got here in the demand is a declining demand rate. And basically the same reasons that I mentioned in the commercial energy rates, I'm suggesting that we should not have a declining demand rate. And so again, over time, what I'm doing is working to even out the demand rates that we've got. Now, when you look at the energy rate, you would say, well, that's a declining rate as well, because the first one is 6.6 cents and the other is 4.4. But this is a unique kind of rate. It's called a right rate, which right spelled with a W. It's after I guess the gentleman who came up with it however long ago it was. Where the block actually changes based on the size of the customer, because it's 250 kilowatt hours per kW. So if you're a 100 kW customer, the first block is 250 times 100. If you're a 200 kW customer, it's 250 times 200. So that first block gets bigger if you're a bigger customer. I could go into a long discussion about load factor and how all of that works, but in this case, that energy rate structure is not a problem. However, that demand structure, because again, what's happening here is the smaller general service folks are paying a much higher bill than the larger ones because they're not getting into that cheaper demand cost. And really, there's no sort of justification for that. So again, I'm saying over time that I'm bringing up the second demand while bringing down that first demand until we get to sort of a sense of equilibrium over time. And again, as you said, if you wanted to jump all the way to the end and not have this transition over time, I would be okay with that, same as the discussion we had earlier. And ultimately, when we sort of get down through the rest of these now, there's a general and municipal demand time of use rate. Same thing, declining demand rates. I've got some suggestions for leveling those out. There's a municipal service EM12 rate. Let me get this so people at home can see it. This basically mirrors, this is just the commercial rate for municipal, but it's basically the same rate. So the rate here mirrors what we've got going on in the regular commercial service rate. Likewise, there is a municipal demand rate, which mirrors the general service demand rate. So I've got the same thing, recommendation occurring there. And then there's an interruptible general service, and again, working to levelize those demand rates into the future, sort of under the same kind of theory and explanation that I mentioned when I was talking about the general service demand rate. And then actually have no recommended changes in either the security lighting or the streetlights at this time. That it just varies based on size of fixture, and those rates all made sense to me. So again, these recommendations, some customers will see slight changes in their bills, either up or down. Overall revenues for the utility won't change, except for as sales might change, but, you know, under these assumptions that are within here. And you need to keep your eye on the ball going forward, particularly after the next 2 or 3 years, just to make sure that you're meeting all of the requirements and all of the reserves that you've got going. And, you know, just depending upon how a number of those things that we listed, and they're actually listed in the cover letter as well as in the rate recommendations, in particular, some of the things that could change the most and have the most impact on the bottom line. So any other questions?
So you showed a chart of 3.3 of 2017. At the end
Yes.
of all this, what would this chart look like?
That actually won't change much.
Okay.
Yeah, because the overall level of revenues really won't change very much. There's a very slight, almost immeasurable increase in commercial, and the others are, for all intents and purposes, their revenues don't change on a total.
This is the comparison of cost versus revenues.
Yes,
So-
but it's
so-
on a percentage basis as well. So if overall sales don't change, and if your way that your expenses look as you go forward, you're not going to really see much difference in the overall percentage to serve. And then if revenues aren't changing, you're not going to really see any differential in the percentage of revenue from any given group.
So residential will still be paying slightly more than they should be, or?
Well, that's saying it a little stronger.
Okay.
It's
I'm sorry.
slightly more than what the table shows, but the table differentials are it's kind of like poles. It's sort of within the margin of error. It's within the margin of assumptions, because oftentimes cost of service is referred to as both an art and a science. And in fact, many of you know Glenn Cannon. He used to say that it's 95% voodoo, is what he used to tease me about relative to cost of service. I could actually go and change assumptions to other perfectly acceptable assumptions, and I could change those results by 2 or 3% and still have what would be called acceptable cost of service analysis. That's why you never look at them as sort of an exact number, but as really a guide.
And you said a guide was like within 5%.
Yeah. And if I wanted to do sort of results-oriented, I could play enough with the assumptions to get those numbers really, really close. And and I would have somebody who also is in this business look and say, yeah, those assumptions look reasonable. So I'm satisfied that, you know, we don't need to make any significant changes relative to the cost of service amongst total revenues in the classes. However, deeper in that analysis relative particularly to the thinking behind the inverted rate versus the declining block rates, and particularly also those declining demand rates, the cost of service analysis has also impacted what I've suggested needs to happen with the rates, just to sort of clean them up. I think there's some legacy things in the design, and there's sort of a mix of legacy, because you've got, you know, you can look at the rates to a certain extent and say, well, which is it? Because you've got the inclining block rate in the residential with the declining block rates for some of the larger customers. And there's a bit of a mixed message in those two things.
Okay.
I mean, to me, that's another reason to try to get rid of that declining block rate for the commercial and others, you know, over a few years instead of maintaining it throughout the next 4 years.
And as a policy decision, like I said, if you want to do that, I personally have no heartburn with that. So, you know, I've made my recommendation, but with the caveat that if you know, because you get to make those policy decisions as a board, and if you were insistent on that, I would be perfectly happy that you would do that. It wouldn't,
But
would
based
really
on your-
go against my ultimate recommendation.
Based on your recommendation, I mean, obviously, this has to be reviewed in a year and ongoing, just to see, okay,
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
what has changed, what has happened that may impact what the future thoughts would be.
See, and another thing is certain things, for instance, we've got in the commercial, the customer charge is coming down slightly while that last energy block is coming up. Well, you get to the point where you need additional revenue, you could freeze the customer charge portion of the rate while bringing that second block up a little bit further. Now you'd be generating additional revenue.
So, Bob, are you suggesting maybe Daryl and David sit down and look at something like that? Or, you know, I agree with you, but I don't particularly care whether it's over 4 years, 5 or 6 years.
I mean, I don't feel strongly about it, I just, maybe something to talk about a little bit. But just for all the reasons you give, it just kind of keeps coming back to me. It's not a big deal, but it's simpler, it's in the direction that we want to go, it's explainable. It just would make sense to me, but.
So I think maybe Daryl, if there's, I don't know if you can look at any individual commercial accounts that
I'd be curious to see.
any
yeah.
drastic effect. If Bob, I mean, if what he's saying doesn't have any real drastic effect, maybe we should do it.
Well, I think in particular, you won't see anybody that would be particularly drastic in the regular commercial. Some of the ones where the general service with the demand and some of those demand rates,
Those are complex.
those you got to look a little more carefully because the balance of demand versus energy and at what levels and so on. In particular, some of the biggest customers within that class.
You'd want to pull some of that and, I mean, it could theoretically be, right, that the smaller commercial class, it's easier to make a transition quicker, where some of the larger, you wouldn't want to rip it off like a Band-Aid. I mean, it might really need to be sensitive to what that looks like for different sizes of businesses to make sure we were doing it appropriately.
Daryl, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea to run some actual scenarios to see how it's going to impact some of our larger customers, some of our smaller customers. And we can do that over the next 30 days before the next board meeting. Let's take some specific examples, run the numbers, and see what kind of an impact it does have.
You've got a lot of, you've got seasonal rates, and you've got a number of blocks. So you can have a customer where the impact on them in the winter might be different than the impact on them in the summer. And, so there's a lot of moving parts. I'm not saying that, and your rates aren't complex really, but to a certain extent, you could say they're kind of busy. And so, you can have average change, which is zero, but you can have endpoints that can be, quite a ways on one side or the other, depending upon the month and depending upon the customer.
I certainly think where the 5-year spread, if they're looking at last year to what happened this year, it's not going to make much difference, but if you slam it all in 1 year, it might look different, even though they're not paying more overall for the entire 12 months. That would be a reason to drag it out for 5 years, and then, of course, there's always a caveat of, hey, in year 4, we need X amount increase. You could stop the customer decrease charge, bump up that last rate, and maybe you're there.
The other thing on the demand rates, you could stop the decline of the first block, and then you could increase the second block faster. So, of course, now that increase would impact different customers in different ways as well.
I think what we're asking is take a look at it and then give us a recommendation if it's doable in 4 years or should be something like a 6-year, et cetera, goal. But if we can establish a goal, and then next time we do this, we would see it get eliminated. That would be nice.
And part of the problem, too, is that not only are the demands seasonal, but they're also seasonal depending upon the customer,
Yes.
because their seasons change as well. In other words, even though the summer demand was different, that may be their season.
Yes. Now, one of the things you'll find in seasonal is that summertime impacts residential much more than it does larger customers. Now, some customers have a season because of whatever it is that they do, but like if you've got like an industrial customer that's some sort of a process that just sort of runs all the time, they aren't nearly as impacted by weather the way residential customers are. Because obviously our heat and our air conditioning in our homes is a big piece of our usage, and especially, the increases and decreases in usage depending upon what's going on weather-wise. Whereas for, particularly industrial customers, the weather is kind of irrelevant to their overall energy use. It's a very small margin. In fact, I know of large computer data mills that still run air conditioning in the wintertime to keep the heat down.
All right, so next month's board meeting, we're going to take a look at certain larger businesses, maybe even some residentials or small businesses, and say, okay, what if we did this in 1 year, what would the 2017 usage look like if you did it in 1 year, and what would it look like if you spread it out for 5 years for that business, winter and summer? I think we can do that. I think Dave can do that.
We can do that.
Probably won't be free, but I'm sure we can do it. And then we'll come back to the board and say, okay, here's some specifics. If we just did everything in 1 year, just do it next year, here's your rate. Or what if we?
We're asking that.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily, it just looked to me, I wasn't saying in 1 year, but over 4 years, that seems like a long enough period of time to make, at least with the first group that we were looking at, I mean, they were fairly small changes, so why not get to the ultimate goal in 4 years?
That's like the commercial services, the EC02.
So get to it in 4 years, not one.
Right, I wasn't necessarily saying 1 year, yeah, no.
Well, one thing too is, the residential ones are just 1 year.
Right.
Right.
All of the residential is just a single step, and then they just stay the same.
I mean, and that seems very minute. And
Yes.
if the recommendation is, with some careful eye on the budgeting and a lean capital plan, there's not much change there whatsoever. In fact, the fact that it can hopefully hold for 5 years is great. I mean, the real change there is getting rid of the highest block rate in summer, right? And everything else, this is maybe a very elementary way for me to be saying this, but it does seem the majority of our customers in each of these areas, it does seem somewhat minute, right? The changes seem.
I thought they were very small, which again, I think what you're saying is we don't need to make much change, so don't make much change. Probably what I was reacting to as much as anything and saying, maybe not very well, was we've got a 4-year, period we're looking at. We're making fairly small changes per year, and why not get to the ultimate goal, which for these commercials is, get rid of this block, this change in rate by usage by the end of the 4-year period, That's what I was trying to say, is make the adjustment over the 4 years.
But I would also, anything that you're going to do over 4 years, I would not cast in stone. In other words, whatever change you're going to make for the first year is the only change I would officially.
No, I realize.
Because you have to be ready to always sort of set rates every year, depending on where things are at.
You sort of laid out a plan here.
Yes, exactly. Or you could go just twice as fast as I'm saying and do it in 2 steps instead of 4. Skip to the, instead of the first, go to the second step and then the 4th step.
And since you won't be here next meeting, are you able to meet with Daryl and look at those numbers of those accounts to see? Yeah, just so we know your thoughts next month. So.
I mean, I don't think it's a huge deal one way or the other, but I just think it's simpler.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay?
I think the bottom line for most people is that the changes are very small, if at all.
Right.
And I think that that's the message we want everybody to understand, is that, hey, there's not going to be a whole lot of rate changes, and we're trying to find a way to make it even better. Thank you.
Okay,
Dave.
thank you.
Appreciate that. Thanks, Dave. All right. Anything else before we move on? Monthly department reports.
First, with finance and customer accounts, in July, Monica and I attended the Skip Collier EUSO short course that was hosted by IAMU. We continue to work through billing conversion issues. We generated our first bill for each billing cycle, and we've been working to generate the first round of auto pay, which
You need to switch for the.
prior to writing this, it is now generated, and so is the second one. We continue to work with Cogsdale and Extended Systems on improvements to the billing and payment process.
Thank you. Communication and education, Jen?
We are doing our next newsletter coming out in September, so that work is being done right now with the design. And then this will be our first newsletter where we're using InfoSend to send the newsletter for us. Currently, and well, I guess always in the past, we have printed it locally and then hand-stuffed every bill. Now that we've got this new billing system, they will print them for us and put them in the newsletters. So when they come out in September, this will be our first time that we'll be utilizing that service.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, we did, for the Heritage Days Parade, we did have our truck, and quite a few of our employees, along with their family members, participated in that community event. In our department, we've also been helping out the finance department with payments and that sort, so we've tried to step up and help out as best we can with this new transition in billing. The media that was placed was with K-Way Radio, the Waverly newspaper, and 93.5 The Mix. We also do posts on Facebook and Twitter and our online newsletter.
Okay, thank you. Generation and substations, Kurt?
Staff's been busy just on general maintenance this time of year with and mostly the generation plant. We really can't take the plant down for large maintenance items, so it's more light maintenance until we get into the fall and winter months. We're also continuing to prep our work for the Southfield Center switchgear project, which is set to start the end of September, mid-September timeframe. Staff will begin demolition at the Southfield Center on that project with the new equipment showing up here on the 1st of October. Again, we have to kind of time that with the timing of the year. We don't want to take the substation down during, peak load times of air conditioning season. Underground crews have been staying busy with fiber and electric service drops. Construction is staying fairly steady. It's not anything that they can't handle, but they're definitely staying busy with the day-to-day stuff that's coming in. Bremer Avenue reconstruction is going to be coming up here pretty soon. As soon as the roadway gets completed, staff will be installing the repainted lights, the poles mostly that have been faded over time, and then making sure that all the LED lights are installed in the east side of Bremer Avenue once that project gets completed, and the roadway work anyway. 20th Street Northwest, we did remove the street lights in that area for the railroad construction project that's going on right now. We're soon to start. Once that project's done, we'll be installing temporary lights until next year, where we'll take those back out again when the roadway project is completed or started.
Okay. Very good. Any other questions on the monthly reports from anyone? Okay, we'll move to the Waverly Communications Utility action items. Ratify the trade accounts. I need a motion and a second to approve the Waverly Communications Utility trade accounts.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion or questions?
It's just
See?
mainly your typical monthly expenses on this one.
Just a typical month? Okay. All those in favor of ratification, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Information items from our Waverly Communications Utility, the annual service level metrics. Jeff?
Easy to say, right?
Yeah.
So
At least you didn't just use an acronym for it.
Right. So this was an outcome of our strategic planning last year, where we established benchmarks for our fiber distribution, our video service, internet service, and phone service. And we established those at 99.99, so 4 nines for our distribution system, internet, and phone service. So just talking number of minutes, that's a 53-minute outage over the year, over 365 days. So it comes out to over 500,000 minutes per year. So, and then on the video side or TV service, we have that at 99.95. And the reason that they're just a little bit different is that while we have a pretty robust redundant system, we can't automatically fail over our video services. It's routed differently than internet and phone service. So we took that just a little bit higher or lower, however you're looking at it. But that's about 263 minutes total that we'd be able to have some type of a video outage and stay within our metric. So let's see if we can tighten. And difficult to read. So where we stood for the year, and it measures July 1 to July 1, so 2017 through 2018. We met the metrics for our fiber distribution, and fortunately, middle 2017, we actually buried a portion of the fiber that runs down to Cedar Falls, and that reduced the number of rodent chews that we experienced probably 2016, 2017. So fiber distribution, we had a few outages, again, mainly rodent chews within the city, but from a weighted average standpoint, they're pretty low compared to total number of customers. Our internet capacity or our internet metric was 1/100th of a percentage point below what we set as a metric. So that's primarily due to some changes. We try to load balance where we can as far as capacity goes. Some of those changes went awry and took our metric down. And then as far as video and phone service, we had the 4 nines of service availability. So I think we'll keep the same metrics going forward and kind of learn from what we made some mistakes on as far as some change management. Any
Very good.
questions?
Tough keeping rodents out of anything.
It is.
So Jeff, just 4 nines is kind of an industry standard as well, is it not? Phone company?
Yeah, phone company likes to go up to 5 nines, which, you get about less than 10 minutes of outage during the year. So, yeah, 4 nines is pretty acceptable industry standard.
Okay. Any questions, anyone? All right, monthly department reports. Jeff, that's you as well, starting out.
I moved myself up on top of the list, so I don't have to go last anymore. So telecom staff continue to install new service. We're running at a pretty good pace as far as demand goes. And then responding to service calls. So as our customer base has increased, obviously our service calls have also. Recently, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we had a pretty good lightning strike in town, and that's increased our support calls over time also, or at least over the last 2 weeks. The 7-digit dialing to Shell Rock is fixed. I think that was fixed shortly after our last meeting, but this
That's
is
been
our
going on a long
first
time.
update. Yeah, I tried to look back. I think it was going back to May. It
Right.
might have been May to July. July 18th is when it was fixed.
Glad it was finally resolved.
Yep. So we're routing those calls off of a different carrier rather than CenturyLink.
Okay.
We worked on a Metro Ethernet service or a 1 gig link down to Cedar Falls for a large industrial customer, so that's up and running. That was probably one of our first connections going between ourselves and other service providers. Completed the migration for the city, so that was quite a few phone lines, different locations, 11 different locations, probably 80-plus phone lines. So that was a big migration. And then provided internet and internet service for the fair. And we had it installed in time for Heritage Days, so they were able to take advantage of it at the same time.
I've had people tell me they really appreciated that as well.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Finance and customer accounts, Casey?
The CSR staff continues to perform the day-to-day functions of billing, troubleshooting, technical calls, and scheduling install service calls. And we filed and paid a lot of quarterly regulatory reports.
Okay. Jen?
Our newest campaign will be starting later this week, and it's called Punch Up Your Speed. It will be focusing on the visual of a child with a punching bag and punching gloves on, and talking about getting your speeds back up for the school year. So a lot of people that don't use our service have lower speeds, and so this way they know that they're going to be having to utilize those a lot more once school gets back in session again. So that campaign will feature both the newspaper ad, the radio commercial, and Facebook campaign.
Okay, very good. Any questions from anyone? All right, as per Iowa Code 22.7, confidential competitive information, I will entertain a motion and a second to go into closed session.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Secretary, please call the roll.
Buckingham,
Yes.
Neuendorf,
Yes.
Brunkhorst,
Aye.
Sagerman,
Yes.
Biverberg.
Yes. Session, are we back on now for?
No, we don't.
Okay, all right. I need a motion and a second to approve the Waverly Communications Utility Financials as presented.
Move approval.
Second.
Discussion, questions?
Sorry.
It's not a roll call vote, it's a voice vote, isn't it? All those in favor of the approving the WCU financials as presented, say aye.
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 Those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. We are adjourned.
Good job, Jerry.
Good job.
Not bad.
Done before 3. I like that.